Okay, hello. Today I'm joined by Richard J. Evans. Richard Evans is a historian of 19th and 20th century Europe. He's a professor of history at the University of Cambridge. He's the Provost of Gresham College in London. He's the author of many books: The Coming of the Third Reich, Third Reich in Power, Third Reich at War, In Defense of History, Telling Lies About Hitler, and The Pursuit of Power. But today we're discussing Richard's latest fantastic book, which is a biography on Eric Hobsbawm, which is here. But just before we get into it, Richard, I just want to ask about you. How have the past few months been?
Okay, well, we live now, because I have retired as a professor from Cambridge, so I don't have to go and give lectures or anything like that. We live in North Hertfordshire in the country, so there's plenty of space, a large garden, and lots of lovely country walks. So all that's not too bad. I haven't really been out. I've been under lockdown because I'm vulnerable. I'm sorry to say I'm over 70, so that makes me vulnerable in one sense. It's been okay. It's been fine, actually. I've started to venture out, but not very much. And I'm continuing to be very careful. But I've done a lot of things I usually do: writing a book, correcting proofs, doing articles for the press, all that kind of stuff. I'm very lucky. I don't have small children. I don't have to provide education for them, and I didn't have a job. I don't have a job that requires me to go out a lot.
So A.J.P. Taylor once said that biography is not history, but every historian must do it at least once. Now, of all the great historians that have passed through the academy, so A.J.P. Taylor himself, Edward Thompson, Christopher Hill, why did you choose Eric Hobsbawm to be your subject?
Well, like many books that I've written, it came about to a large extent rather by chance. Of course, it slotted into my interest, but I didn't intend to write a biography of him. But if you, when you're elected a Fellow of the British Academy, which is the National Academy of the Humanities and Social Sciences, you get a nice letter from the secretary saying, congratulations, you can do this and you can do that. And by the way, can we have materials for your obituary? Which sort of gives you a bit of a start. But every Fellow of the British Academy gets a lengthy obituary in the proceedings of the British Academy, which means basically only about 5 people read them. And some of these are real works of scholarship. It's quite normal to go, for the obituaries, to go and check out original sources, talk to the family and so on. And if you want to find out about any 20th century British historian of distinction, pretty well all of them have these obituaries or biographical memoirs. So I was asked to do Eric Hobsbawm's when he died in 2012. I knew him, not terribly well, but I did know him and had known him over quite a long period. And I'm kind of about as sympathetic to his politics as anybody could be. I consider myself a social democrat. I never was a communist and don't share his views on that score. So I went to his house when I was asked, and I found the whole of the top floor absolutely covered in papers, files, folders, boxes, masses of unpublished stuff. And the family were very helpful, and so I went through this stuff. I took one of my PhD students, and we were there for about 3 days, basically digitizing a lot of the handwritten stuff, a lot of it completely unknown. So I thought, well, okay, I'll do this obituary, this biographical memoir, but it's worth a full biography, because he was a great historian. He was one of the most influential historians of the 20th century. His books were published in about 50 languages. They were bestsellers. In Brazil alone, his book sold over 1 million copies. Quite astonishing in Portuguese. And he lived through and took part in a lot of the major events of the 20th century. He was there in Berlin at the rise of Hitler, the triumph of Hitler. He ventured into Spain during the Spanish Civil War, though only for a day, and he was ushered out by anarchists when they discovered he was a communist. He took part in the Bastille Day celebrations in Paris after the Popular Front was elected. He was in the army in the Second World War, though he never fired a shot in anger. He was there in the Cold War as a communist, at the receiving end of the very diluted version of McCarthyism, which prevailed in the UK, but he was under surveillance from MI5. And so, and he never threw anything away. I mean, he lived till the age of 95, and from the moment of his arrival in the UK, 1933, he just kept everything. So I thought it's wonderful, wonderful material. And he was a terrific writer. A lot of this unknown, unpublished stuff that I found is beautifully written and wonderfully evocative accounts of the age and the things he did. So I thought, right, let's do this. And I got the support of the family. I got exclusive and unfettered access to all the material, found a publisher, and I got a grant because I wanted to do it as quickly as I could, because I wanted to give it to his widow, Marlena. Although she was a good deal younger than him, she was still in her 80s when I started. So off I went, basically. I had research assistants for the grant for languages I couldn't deal with myself, and places it would be easier to get somebody to research in, like Vienna or Brazil or Berlin or France, Paris. So off I went. Yeah, that's why I decided to do it.
So you've discussed the key events in his life. We'll go into them in a bit more detail. So at the age of 14, he becomes an orphan. His mother dies, who he's very close to. What do those early years look like for him, and what's he interested in intellectually? What's going on in his life?
Yeah, well, excuse me. He did write his own autobiography called Interesting Times, and of course I was a bit worried about that. But it's really about the public face of his life. There's very little about his inner life. It's most useful for the early part of his life, where he does provide details which I couldn't otherwise have discovered. But he is actually, there's a lot of misunderstanding here among people who've written about him. He was not a refugee. He was not Austrian. He was British. Was not Jewish in the sense of practicing Jew. His family were all secular. So he was born in Alexandria in 1917 because that's where his parents, who'd met there before the war, his father and his uncle had jobs there in the British-run postal telecommunications system. His mother was Austrian, and so during the war, that was a kind of relatively neutral place that they could be, because they came from opposing sides in the war, as it were. They went to live in Vienna immediately afterwards, and he grew up in Vienna. I was quite surprised when I recorded a program with him at the end of the 90s in German, to hear he spoke German with a very strong Austrian accent. It's very, very distinctive. That never left him. So I got hold of his school reports, and the most interesting thing about them, apart from the fact that history was not always his best subject, was they were kind of survival from the Habsburg Empire. And so they were pre-printed, and there's obviously had sort of thousands were left over from the imperial days. And they had a box where the teacher filled in your native language, because the Habsburg Empire was a multilingual system. And his was English/German. So he was bilingual. English is not a foreign language. And he was, of course, a British citizen. His mother was a translator from English into German of fiction, and she insisted the family spoke English at home. So that was surprising. I think the death of his father from a heart attack when he was 12 and his mother from tuberculosis when he was 14. And I found his mother's letters absolutely heartrending when she was dying. I think those had a huge effect on him. I think the rest of his life, he was searching for a community, a substitute family, a kind of group to identify with. And I think that's, in a way, the secret of the fact that he became communist and why he never abandoned communism, at least with a small c, the ideology, and remained a member of the Communist Party, although in many ways that was a name only, until it dissolved itself at the beginning of the 90s. So in Berlin, because he had to go and live with his sister and his uncle and aunt in Berlin when his mother died, that's where he became politicized. Other people I talked to over the years who'd been at school in Berlin in the early 30s said you were either a communist or you were Nazi. And because he was British, he was called Der Engländer, the English boy in school, and he was Jewish. He couldn't possibly join the Nazis, so he became a communist. And then he records. He wrote a few stories already about the Communist Party in Berlin in the early 30s. His sister, a younger sister, remembered cycling past, after delivering communist leaflets, cycling past the Reichstag on the 27th of February 1933 and seeing it in flames. So it was full on. And he got to England and found it terribly disappointing. I mean, the communists had 100 members of the Reichstag. There wasn't a single communist MP. They could put 100,000 people onto the streets of Berlin for a demonstration at a few hours' notice. It was a tiny little sect in England. And that too, I think, was part of his makeup, that he thought that what's the point of being left-wing if you can't achieve power? And so he actually canvassed in elections for the Labour Party already in 1935 and then again in 1945. So I think it's a very important aspect of his growing up and shaping him. Not as a historian, he didn't want to be a historian at that point, but his whole political and social outlook.
So he doesn't leave Germany out of exile. It was for economic reasons. Does he have any run-ins with the Nazi Party, or are they actually few in number?
No, I mean, his uncle and aunt left for Britain, where there were other members of the family, because a business venture failed. And this is like in the early spring of 1933. So the thought that they were Jewish obviously must have entered his head, and it was dangerous as Hitler was consolidating his power. But basically it was financial. And he went to what was in retrospect a very good, ambitious school in St Marylebone Grammar School in London. And I think that's, again, because he felt very, he defined himself already in his diaries. And I've got his diaries for from the moment he got to Britain right up to 1951, and with some gaps. And he thought of himself as an intellectual, which is quite extraordinary. At the age of 15 or 16, he decided he wasn't a street fighter. He couldn't do that, and so he never had that kind of run-in with the Nazis. There were moments when he felt rather afraid, and which communicated in some of his writings at the time.
So he arrives at King's College, Cambridge in 1936, and one person writes, "There's a freshman at King's who knows everything." Mm. Now, what do his university years look like? What does he get involved in? How does it stimulate him intellectually?
Well, I think because he felt he was an intellectual, and he felt rather alienated from his uncle and aunt in some ways. So he was very, very fond of his aunt. He just read amazing amounts of stuff. I mean, every week he had in these diaries, he had a Leserchronik, they're written in German, a chronicle of reading, and they're absolutely terrifying. We got through more in a week than I could get through in a year. You know, huge novels in French, English, and German. Lots of works of Marx and Lenin. So he knew an enormous amount, had a very, very retentive memory. Crucially, not just Marxist, communist stuff, but very wide literary reading as well. So that was more important to him than his school, really. Nevertheless, his teachers spotted that he was very clever. So he was the first boy from the school actually to go to Cambridge. There was a new headmaster who was turning it into a kind of on the model of a public school, though it was a state school, and so he got to Cambridge, and I thought, damn it, this is awful, because his diary stops when he gets to Cambridge. It's a wonderful source, but it didn't start again until during the war. So I had these 3 missing years, and then I was interviewing his best friend, his cousin Ron's daughter. His cousin Ron was his best friend when he was in London. And she said, "Oh yes, you might be interested in these. We're moving house. I've just been clearing out, and I found this suitcase in the attic, and it's got all these letters in it." And in fact, from 1936-39, when he was at Cambridge, he wrote letters, several a week sometimes, enormously long letters to Ron. So they're like a substitute. They're like a diary, sort of 10 pages about what he's been doing, and then, oh, by the way, how are you at the end, sort of thing. So that was a terrific relief and a wonderful discovery. He was not impressed by the history faculty in Cambridge. He went out of interest to see G.M. Trevelyan, who was the most famous historian in Britain at the time. It was very old-fashioned, sort of Whig history. There were a lot of historians who he didn't really think much of at all, but there was one who did impress him, and that was Munir Poston. And Poston was a real sort of stuck out like a sore thumb in Cambridge. He was professor of economic history, but he was actually born in Bessarabia. He spoke many different languages, and he thought of history as a social science. And his lectures apparently always sort of began by expounding some kind of theory and then demolishing it and then putting forward a theory of his own. So, and Hobsbawm found this tremendously exciting. So Poston became a kind of mentor to Hobsbawm. And that continued. He looked, even though he was anti-Marxist, anti-communist, Poston liked Hobsbawm and other young Marxists like Victor Kiernan because they were interested in social theory and economic theory. So he very quickly, Hobsbawm, that's when he joined the Communist Party, and he started to edit their magazine or their newsletter. But he found their concentration on politics, oddly, very constricting. He went to the cinema a lot, and he became a film critic for the Marxist magazine, but they didn't like that. So he chucked all of that and became editor of Granter, or The Granter, as it was called, their film critic, their editor. He wrote a lot of wonderful essays. He even edited and produced 2 spoof issues, sort of satirical imitations of the New Statesman and similar organs. So he had a much broader kind of outlook than you would expect from a communist or a regular Marxist.
So in 1938 and 1939, 2 crucial events occur in history. So there's the show trials in Russia, and then there's the Nazi-Soviet pact. Now, he both tries to justify and underplay those events. Yeah. So what justifications does he provide, and why does he use them?
Well, I didn't see my role as a biographer to defend everything he said, did, or wrote. You've got to be honest, I think. And so I didn't make any attempt to conceal the fact that he applauded the show trials where Stalin's lieutenants, basically, well-known Bolshevik revolutionaries, were pressured into publicly confessing to having worked against the Bolshevik Party since before the First World War, and by basically, as we know now, through threats to their families if they didn't toe the line. So Hobsbawm was convinced by that because they'd issued their confessions. And a lot of other people, and not just on the left in Britain, were similarly convinced by the show trials and the purges. The Nazi-Soviet pact is easier to justify, or was at the time, because Stalin concluded a pact with Hitler, to a non-aggression pact. It was very clear by August 1939 that Hitler was going to invade Poland. There'd been a huge kind of build-up of anti-Polish propaganda in the Nazi media. What we know now, of course, they didn't know then. The public didn't know, and Hobsbawm didn't know, which was there are secret clauses according to which the Soviets are going to take over the eastern part of Poland, which they did after the Nazis invaded the West, and they're going to take over the Baltic states, part of Bessarabia, and so on. So it's a defensive, fundamentally defensive move on Stalin's part. He knew that he wasn't ready for a war with Nazi Germany, not least because he'd been purging and executing a lot of generals and a lot of managers of arms factories and so on. So I think it's a very curious period for the British Communist Party. Remember, this tiny sort of sect at the beginning of the war, because initially, of course, they see the war in terms of opposing fascism. After all, that's what they'd done in the Spanish Civil War. It was almost their raison d'etre, was opposing fascism. So when you get a Nazi-Soviet pact, and then when you have Stalin, after a short interval, telling them that this is a war between Britain and France, capitalist countries, and Germany, a capitalist country, and so all they're going to do is use the working class as cannon fodder and stay out of it. That was very difficult for many British communists, and I think it's clear that many of them still regarded the fight against fascism as the key point of being a communist, and breathed a huge sigh of relief in June 1941 when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. So it's a difficult, curious period, and Hobsbawm didn't really attempt to justify or even follow that line.
So he's drafted into the army in February 1940. What do the war years look like for Hobsbawm?
Extremely dull. He was so bored he started keeping a diary again, and I do quote from it, but it's pretty dull for that period as well, because he doesn't get to fight. He stays in Britain. He was notoriously impractical man, and yet with the characteristic logic of the British Armed Forces, he was put in the Royal Engineers, just as his cousin Ron, who was colourblind, was put into the Navy and put in charge of on a ship of aircraft recognition. So it gives you a kind of an idea. His diary gives you an idea of what the British squaddies were up to. He wasn't an officer. He was just an ordinary soldier. Eventually became a sergeant. After a while, common sense intervened and he was put into the Army Educational Corps. But then, interestingly, he started using his position as sort of providing education for an intellectual entertainment, if you like, for the troops, to argue for the opening of a second front. Stalin wanted he wanted D-Day to happen in 1942, and it didn't happen until 1944. And Hobsbawm was caught distributing propaganda for a second front, and the British authorities felt this was interfering in politics. So MI5 put him under surveillance, and MI5 made sure that he wasn't posted anywhere abroad. Lucky for him, because the unit he originally belonged to was posted off to Burma and had a terrible time. And so they were very dull. He went and moved around. There's some quite interesting descriptions of everyday life, but not a lot. He did get married, which it turned out to be a big mistake, like a number of wartime marriages. and he felt that his actually wife Muriel Seaman joined the Communist Party to please him, but was never really committed. And things began, as someone who visited them, began to go wrong when she ostentatiously turned up at breakfast reading the Daily Telegraph, but he didn't even notice.
Can you tell us a bit more about his relationship with MI5?
Yes, well, they released it. He tried to get hold of his files, but they refused. But after he died, they did release them in the National Archives, all apart from the last file. They're under a 50-year rule, so that will be released sometime in the future. And they're very thorough. But he was, of course, completely harmless. He didn't do anything. He couldn't be a spy because he wasn't working for the British government, and he was too well known as a communist anyway. And so while they were keeping him under tabs, at one point tapping his phone, opening his correspondence, which is how I find some of the love letters from a French girlfriend at one point in the 50s, going to meetings and reporting when he spoke, all of that kind of stuff. Nothing of any major interest at all. Whereas, of course, Burgess, Philbin, Maclean, Blunt, the famous Cairncross, the famous Cambridge Five, who were doing real serious damage to agents, to Britain and so on, they were okay because they were public school boys and sort of probably British, but he was not quite British somehow, spoke with a slight foreign accent, Jewish and so on. So it's a kind of it's a very good example of an area of incompetence of the British Secret Service. I mean, Hugh Trevor Roper, in his wonderful little essay on the Philby affair, absolutely damns them as a MI5, MI6 as a club, clubbish atmosphere, inefficient and hopeless.
So he's tempted by journalism, advertising, and the civil service. He puts an application in for the BBC. What is it that draws him to history?
Well, yes, I mean, he thought of various jobs after the war, but there's an interesting file in the BBC archive, the BBC written archive in Caversham, which I went and had a look at, which MI5 basically, after they've decided, the BBC, they're going to appoint him to a job, MI5 say no, you mustn't do it. So he didn't get the job. But he did do a lot of broadcasts for the third programs, now Radio 3, until again he ran into trouble because some of them were deemed to be too left-wing. He was very good at history. He got a double-starred first, which is very unusual. And in those days, it was so unusual that you had an automatic scholarship for a PhD if that happened, which he got. So in lieu of anything else, he decided to do that. He decided to do a PhD. He was he had an interest. He got a sort of undergraduate scholarship at King's before the war in 1938 to write a dissertation on agrarian conditions in North Africa. And he spent some time in North Africa in the summer vacation, going around talking to French officials and so on, and wrote quite an interesting dissertation. But he decided he couldn't do a PhD on that because he got married and he didn't feel he should spend months away in North Africa. So he asked Poston for advice, and Poston said, do the Fabians. This is a really bad piece of advice because the Fabians were gradualist socialists, people like Shaw, the Webbs and so on. And they believed in, it was named after the famous Roman general who kind of wore down the enemy by attrition. And that was their tactic. And as soon as he got into reading up about them for his dissertation, he realized that, as he said, they were kind of bourgeois liberals, really. They weren't socialists at all, and he really rather despised them. In addition, he wasn't allowed access to the Webb's papers because they were reserved for the official biographer, which was R.H. Tawney, well-known Christian socialist, a well-known socialist intellectual who unfortunately never came round to writing his biography. So that was a real disaster, I think. He never published it. He carved an article out of it later on.
He becomes a jazz critic for the New Statesman.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, I should add about what the Fabians did was he got access to the LSE library, the British Library of Economic and Political Science, and found enormous amount of trade union material there, and that got him into the history of trade unionism, which is his fellowship dissertation, and then the whole then the conditions of the working class, and that was really what interested him. So that set him off. He got divorced in 1953, but before that his wife had kicked him out. He hoped he could still make it with her because she was in the Communist Party. Nothing. It was rather sort of tragicomic, really, reading his divorce diary, as I call it, again in German. But she did in the end boot him out. He had to go and live in King's. He had a junior research fellowship. I've been around the rooms in the Gibbs building. They're undoubtedly much larger and more palatial than the flat he had in Clapham. But he's got some very funny passages in his diary about the fellows of King's, who he considered all to be hopelessly boring, I'm afraid. It's changed now, of course, much for the better. But that's when that came to an end, he no longer had free accommodation. And in 1947, he had got a job again at the suggestion actually of his tutor, Christopher Morris, in Cambridge, in King's, as a lecturer in economic and social history at Birkbeck, which is London University's evening classes college. And when Cambridge history faculty found out, they were absolutely furious with him. He hadn't bothered to tell them, and he was still doing his dissertation. So Poston stepped in and smoothed that over. And then also, I mean, his relations with the faculty were not terribly good. So when he finally submitted his PhD dissertation, which he had typed up in London, it was rejected because the paper was the wrong size. It was not the right size of paper. And Poston again stepped in to smooth things over by saying it needed to be larger than the prescribed format because he had to put graphs and tables in and stuff. So he got to London. He had an income as a lecturer at Birkbeck, but it wasn't very much. And he had a flat in Bloomsbury within walking distance of Birkbeck, which was rather expensive, as flats in London still are. And so he needed extra money, and he was talking to a friend about this, and this chap said, well, he was involved with the New Statesman. He said, well, why don't you go and become jazz critic for the New Statesman? And because Hobsbawm had been introduced to jazz in the 30s by his cousin, his first cousin, Dennis Preston, who later became a jazz and pop record producer, eminent enough to warrant his own biography in the Dictionary of National Biography. So he's a really serious jazz enthusiast. And he'd been bowled over by Duke Ellington at Streatham Palais. He went to hear it in the mid-30s. And he kept going with jazz. So he went to the editor, Kingsley Martin, famous editor of the New Statesman, and said, look, you know, other papers have got other magazines, they all have a jazz critic. You need one. I know more about jazz. I mean, Kingsley Amis is a jazz critic and he doesn't know anything at all about jazz. So the editor said, yes, all right. Well, okay, well, you can do it and we'll pay you this and that. And you write a weekly column, but don't write too much about jazz because our readers are mostly male civil servants in their 40s who lead very dull lives and they want to know about what goes on in the Soho clubs. So Hobsbawm said, all right, he did. And I found his membership card of Muriel's Colony Club, which was an incredibly loose and disreputable place with Muriel, unbelievably rude, in charge of it. People like George Melly and Francis Bacon, whom Muriel called daughter, used to frequent it. Very, very drunk. It wasn't Eric's thing. So eventually he went to the Downbeat Club, which is where the jazz musicians went after their performances, and he could talk with them and chat with them, and they treated him as a sort of curiosity, the professor who knows about jazz. And so I plowed through all of his articles for the New Station, and there were lots and lots, scores of them. And after a while, he got rather bored by jazz, curiously enough. He found it was very repetitious. And then Kingsley Martin must have hauled him in and said, "You're writing too much about jazz. What about the clubs?" So he wrote this fantastic double-length essay on strip clubs. You can imagine Eric Hobsbawm going around the strip clubs of Soho, and he pours his classic. It's a sort of political. It's a kind of social investigation, right? He talks to the girls. He talks to the managers. I don't think he talked to the clients, but works out their different rates of pay, and it ends up rather quixotically by saying the girls should all join a union. As if, because their working conditions and pay and so on would not have satisfied a factory inspector in the 1840s. So that winds down in the end when he gets married for the second time to Marlena. One of the reviewers of the book said, "And then happened the biographer's curse, a happy marriage." Because you teach at Birkbeck between 6 and 9 in the evenings because it's part-time and all the students were working adult education. So he'd head off after he'd wrapped up his teaching to the clubs in Soho. And the Downbeat Club was quite famous. It was lightly disguised. The features in a novel by Colin McInnes, which has turned into a film so disastrous that it bankrupted the film company, but that's another story. So he always had a certain interest in jazz. So I remember going to his 80th birthday party, and at the end of it, about 11 o'clock, he said, "Right, let's all head off for Ronnie Scott's club." But I'm not a huge jazz fan, and it was rather late for me. So I said, "No, we won't. I won't come."
We'll talk about his work. So, what do you think is his strongest book?
I think his strongest book is Bandits. It's a short book. It's a spin-off from the Primitive Rebels. He got interested. I mean, like all the great Marxist historians you mentioned, Hill, Hilton, Thompson, and so on. He wrote his influential books, really, after 1956, after they'd all left the party, apart from him. But intellectually speaking, he cut loose from the orthodox communist line at that point. And Bandits is wonderful, wonderful historical, somebody called it a squib, I think. He has this thesis of social banditry. And if you look at stuff on banditry now, they're still discussing his arguments more than half a century later, that bandits are embedded in the local peasant population and represent kind of their resentments against the authorities, which is a slightly romantic view, I think. But it covers Britain, it covers South America, it covers India. He has a wonderfully entertaining retelling of all the legends and the stories, the songs, all of these things. And it's a perfect combination of empirical detail and large-scale theorizing, and enormously entertaining and readable. I think it's his strongest book. Some of the others are dated a bit, though they're still in print. So The Age of Revolution in particular, it's 1962, and that is a kind of Leninist book, and you can see Leninist theses that don't really work coming through it, but it's still a wonderful read.
So in the conclusion of the book, you talk about various criticisms you've got. So his accounts are typically quite Eurocentric.
Yeah,
there isn't enough emphasis on gender issues, gender inequalities. He's got a contempt for classical and modern music, really. And of course, his Marxist class-based analysis also heavily influences his history. So if you were to pick the greatest criticism of Hobsbawm's work in its entirety, what would it be?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think it is. I think the class-based analysis is still defensible. He starts every book with of the great age of books with the economy, and that's the basis everything else is built. But you can defend that. I think it's not blindly Eurocentric. So it's remarkable how in Industry and Empire, for example, he derives the British Industrial Revolution from the cotton trade with India. It's imperialism really and the monopolization of the Indian market for cotton clothing that then I think in his view triggers the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and it's quite remarkable. And of course he does cover Latin America. He came to know Latin America very well, and for a while thought that was a place where revolution was going to happen. I think he doesn't say anything about Africa. That's a major weakness. He's not interested in Africa, apart from North Africa, which he knew, of course, very well from his undergraduate dissertation. And the biggest problem, I think, with his work is, as you said, the gender aspect. He just doesn't, like Marxists, like all Marxists really, he sees class as the moving principle in history, in modern history at any rate. And the, class is based on men, basically. So he sparked this huge, still ongoing debate in the early 50s about the standard of living of the working class in the Industrial Revolution. Did it fall, as he said, or did it rise, as the defenders of capitalism said? But it's all based on male earnings. He included, he's not interested in women because you just slot them into the male-based class interpretation of history. And in the Age of Empire, largely because it become unavoidable, he has a chapter about women, but it's not very good. You can see he doesn't really want to write it. He just sort of sense of duty about it. And he wrote some rather ill-advised, at least one particularly ill-advised essay in History Workshop Journal about representations of women in socialist iconography, which was really rather weak, and he shouldn't really have published it. So I think that's the biggest weakness. But all historians have their weaknesses, and to a degree they're the product of their own times. So I don't think one should be too tough on him for that.
So even in the 1990s, he's in denial about the realities of communism, wasn't he? And there's that famous interview with Michael Ignatieff for the Age of Extremes, where Ignatieff asked him, had the Radiant Tomorrow been created, and the loss of 20 million people would have been the price. He said it would have been worth it. So what is it in his makeup, for a man so intelligent, why could he not face up to the facts?
Well, I think you have to go back to his adolescence again, that communism for him was a positive principle at a time. It's only like 15 years after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that he became a communist in 1932. It's built into his identity. I think ultimately he had all sorts of reasons why he did not leave the Communist Party, but that's, I think, is the real reason, not because he would have betrayed the memory of his fellow members of the party who'd been killed by Hitler, because as he was well aware, more of them were killed by Stalin in the purges. It's a hypothetical statement. So if the glorious, you said, the Radiant Tomorrow being created, would it have been worth it? And he defended that by saying, well, look at all the millions who died in order to defeat Hitler, and that was worth it. But I think a few things need to be said there. I mean, one is the number of people who died in World War II was far in excess of what it needed to have been, because Stalin was so completely wasteful of human life. I mean, things are bad enough in Russia under the Nazis, terrible, but he sort of threw a lot of soldiers' lives away. I think the Red Army was not careful enough. The most important thing is, what is this Radiant Tomorrow? Fundamentally, the ideals he believed in, an ideal, abstract ideal of the egalitarian society where everybody owns everything and there's no exploitation, it's not just unfeasible, but it's also doesn't really work. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time in East Germany under the communist regime, and you could see there, if you're going to go through years of training to become a professional or a factory manager or whatever it might be, and you don't get paid more than the people who haven't gone through that training, you don't earn significantly more than they do. You can't better your position. You don't have a future perspective. What on earth is the point? And that's why people left East Germany in droves when they could. And again, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, people said, why should I stay here? I can't improve my position at all. So, and I don't think he took that on board in any way. It's not just the means, in other words, it's also the end. I think that's a problem with communism. He's not talking about the real situation, so he wasn't justifying Stalin's purges and Stalin's mass murder of millions of people. He's say it's a hypothetical, but even that's a real problem, because in the end, of course, it wouldn't have been worth it, because what you get is not a very satisfactory way of running society.
I'm conscious of the time, so I'll finish with two questions. What do you personally get from Hobsbawm's work?
Well, I get enjoyment, first of all. He's, I think the reason why he's so widely read still is that thanks to his mother and his early reading of literature, he is a wonderful writer, and he has fantastic detail, beautiful stories, quotations, examples. I mean, it's a very absorbing, fascinating kind of history. And secondly, that's combined with posing big questions, tackling the big questions, giving large answers. Even if they're wrong, they're debatable. You know, that's what I get. I get intellectual stimulation and enjoyment, and he conjures up the spirit of the past.
And I'll finish with this one. Do you think he's the greatest historian ever?
No, I wouldn't say that, no. He attempted various self-assessments. And I think one of the most interesting ones is where he says that basically historians who last because of the literary quality of their work. It's not, you know, so that's why we still read Gibbon's Decline and Fall, for example. I think that's an interesting, and his work had this literary quality. I think there are many other great historians. He's not the greatest historian ever, but he is certainly one of the historians whose work has lasted. I mean, if my work lasts 60, 70 years after I've written it and people are still reading it, I'll be more than happy.
I'm sure it will.
You never know. Well, you'll be around to see, probably. I won't.
Anyway, Richard Evans, thanks very much.
Okay, good to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you.